Welcome to lecture on reader response criticism. This, you could argue, is the most important way of viewing a literary text, and it forms really the purpose of the entire course, and that is reader response criticism presumes that there are as many readings of a text as there are readers. And in fact, there are many readings of Hamlet as there are interpretations of Hamlet as there are readings of Hamlet. So if I read Hamlet in high school in 10th grade, I get something out of it. I read it again in graduate school, I get something more out of it, something different out of it, and I read it again as a teacher of Hamlet. And each year I glean something different. Why? What's the cause of that difference? Reader response critics focus on that. They say that the reader and the reading context changes, the pre-reading expectations change, the actual reading experience process changes, and therefore the interpretations change, and we need to acknowledge that. It's probably the most honest form of literary criticism. So let's get to it. Alexander Pope identified all the different ways of interpreting that we talk about, and he said this: "Look, 'tis with our judgments as our watches. None go just alike, yet each believes his own." So for a reader response critic, as Pope characterizes, we put a lot of value in how we resonate with a text, how our experiences, our knowledge gleaned from our life experiences influence our reading of a text, and we find that the text that most resonates with us serves the most psychological needs of the reader. Let's get to some principles. History intention is not knowable. It should not direct interpretation to one meaning. This is a central concept in reader response criticism, right? This belief, this sort of postmodern belief that, look, history is just a projection of the present upon the past. New historicists believe that. And so we should not seek history or historical context or the intention of the author as a ground for interpretation. Well, formalism is really mass reader response because you focus on certain similes and metaphors and images and not others, and you have certain connotations of words that other people do not have. Intertextual readings are also really mass reader response because you're bringing your reader response view to other poems and your reader response view to literary criticism, and you're focusing on certain aspects and not others, right? And meta-critics focus on universal principles, but you focus on certain universal principles and not others, and they leave out the idea that one is drawn to certain principles or certain intertextual concepts or certain metaphors or connotations because of one's reading context, and so reader response focuses on that reading context. All right, the texts exist in the perpetual present, and this present situation influences reading whether you want it to or not. Okay? So how you're feeling on that day, what has happened to you in the recent weeks, your girlfriend has just broken up with you, will have a profound effect upon your reading of, say, Hamlet and his inability to be with Ophelia. Okay, so recognition of the reading context of the present situation. Texts are read not in the past and not in the future, but they're read in the present, so the present should be recognized. And then reading process. I think this is most important here, right? The reading process determines meaning. So your pre-reading expectations, right? What's the default context in which you're reading? All texts are embedded in a context, okay? The type of the text that you encounter, what are your reading expectations for that? What happens when you read the text? What words do you focus on? What words do you not focus on? What lines resonate with you? Images resonate with you, and other images and lines don't resonate with you, and why, right? Recognize that. And they all have influence upon your final determination of meaning. Reader response criticism values the text's ability to enlighten the reader's understanding of self. Okay, this is the subjectivity of reader response criticism. Formalists focus on the complexity of a poem, the irony, the tone, the imagery, the metaphors working together. They value complexity, but reader response values how well the text enlightens one's understanding of oneself. So psychological needs are met, and then that text is more valuable than other texts according to response critics. Does reader response create complete interpretive relativism, and this is really what drives this course. Okay, on the lines of objectivity to subjectivity, clearly we have over here textualism, right? And then way over here, as far as the most objective, and then way over here we have reader response as the most subjective and unapologetically subjective. Well, one of the great fears of reader response criticism is that, well, if there are many interpretations as there are readings, as many interpretations as there are readers, then we're in this vast sea of indeterminacy, of ambiguity. What does the text actually mean, right? Who's the sole authority of meaning of the text, right? If we have these infinite plurality of meanings. How can a critic or a judge or a justice claim to be authoritative in a world of multiple viable responses to a text, right? And I mean, it's not that important to get the road not taken exactly right. Nobody gets hurt, nobody's harmed, but for a judge or a justice to interpret the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment's meaning of liberty, he needs to be closer to the objective side than he does the subjective side, right? One would think. Okay, well, what is their response? It's a frustrating response, but the response is don't worry about it, right? There's no one single meaning of a text, and readings should not be judged for their accuracy or universality because each reading assembles the text in a new way, right? Forget the claim for authority, the claim for one interpretation or the desire for one interpretation is misguided. The response critics argue. Okay, well, that doesn't really help us with Supreme Court when we get to interpreting whether or not affirmative action is a violation of the equal protection of the laws or whether or not abortion is a liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. We want our justices to not change their minds every other day about that. We want them to have some objective reasons as to why they interpret the Constitution the way they do. Okay? All right, let's keep going. So, Stanley Fish, he is this most famous reader response literary critic. He believes that we are socially constructed to have similar pre-reading expectations and reading experiences. So relax, right? Reader response relativism, this sea of infinite possible interpretations, isn't this vast sea, but it's a small pond with certain parameters, right, of possible readings that change as situations change. We're all socially constructed in similar ways. And so there's a limit to the infinite sea of viable responses. Extreme reader response is the idea that identity themes, our desire to know ourselves better, determine reading. Each person's most urgent needs are to understand himself, and that is what drives reading for sure. Correct readings are impossible, as I mentioned earlier. A reading of a poem or statute is only corrected to align itself with a reading that chose a specific interpretive approach, right? Formalism, get a certain reading. Intentionalism or historicism, you get a certain reading. Or textualism, you get a certain reading. But texts do not dictate that they be read formally or historically or textually or mimetically, but are always read from the context outlined in reader response critical theory. Okay? You cannot escape that you are the most important person in the relationship between author, text, and reader. Okay? Out of this continuum, it's the reader that has the most influence on meaning, right? Okay? That's their belief. Alright, since reading determines meaning, the context of the reader while pre-reading and reading should at least be acknowledged in any interpretation as a contributor to meaning. And this is what we are going to do, right? We're going to look at pre-reading expectations. We're going to look at the reading experience, the possible available interpretations, and the one that most resonates with one because of one's life experiences. So we're going to analyze that, we're going to approach that in a very honest way. Okay, and I'll map that out for you. So Wolfgang Iser makes the argument that there are, a literary text is a product of a writer's intentional act, obviously, and thus has established parameters of allowable interpretations. Okay, so there's this sort of arena of possible meanings dictated by the author, right? But these are determinant elements which necessitate the creative involvement of the critic, the reader, to ascertain the meaning of the text. Implied reader, key idea, follows the intentional wishes of the reader, and an active reader colors her interpretation through her own subjective viewpoint created by personal life experiences. Okay? So in here, there are many different possible interpretations based on the different life experiences and knowledges of the world, but it's not this infinite sea. Okay. Fish argues that Stanley Fish, right, argues that the reader anticipates occurrences in a given text, and these wish fulfillments or disappointments in one's wishful desires contribute to the subjective meaning assigned to a text. Like readings of a text are solely determined by the similar set of assumptions and reading strategies adopted by a particular interpretive community. Okay? So he's famous for his essay called "Is There a Text in This Class?" 1979. Right? And in that famous essay, he argues that, look, language is ambiguous, but reading contexts are not. We always know in what context we are. We always know what our default mode is. We know what our reading process is, and so should we identify it. Right? An infinite plurality of meanings would be a fear. Right? So he's responding to criticism of reader response. Only if sentences exist in a state in which they are not already embedded. But sentences emerge only in situations, and within those situations, the normative meaning of an utterance will always be obvious, or at least accessible. Right? And so one of the famous ones that he said is, keep off the grass. Okay, all right. Well, that's a sentence, right? And if you just encountered it like I'm writing right now, keep off the grass. Well, all right, yeah, okay. But if you see it as a sign, right, and there's a bunch of grass, well, this is brilliant. Right? Keep off the grass. We get it. Stay off the grass. We just put pesticide on it, or there's a giant dog that's going to bite you right here, right? Big, mean dog, right? Keep off the grass. Whatever the reason, we get it. So that sentence is in a context. If it were encountered without all of this, my handy-dandy eraser, right? And it's not a sign. It just sort of exists. There's no dog, no pesticide, not on the grass, right? Just keep off the grass, right? He's, Fish is saying, well, a default context could be, don't smoke weed, right? Stay off the drugs, kids, right? It's ruining your brain, ruining your ability to think, right? Certainly that could be a context if it did not have what it had with the grass in the background. Okay? All things, all senses are in a context. And if they're not in a context, there's a sort of a default context. And so Fish makes that strong argument. Okay. Well, I want to get to my wedding, which is a text, right? There were poems read, there were vows, there was a I don't know what you call it, but the minister said a few words, and so I want to get to Fish's point here that pre-reading expectations and the reading process are important in determining meaning. Okay, well, in my wedding, there we exchanged vows, and Chrissy wrote her own vows, and I wrote my own vows, and I ended my vows to her with all as my witness, I will love you always. And obviously the all is ambiguous. It's a signifier without a definite signify. And so, I've identified 4 possible interpretations of that all depending upon who you are. Who is the reader, or in this case, the listener, and who the reader is and their pre-reading expectations matters. So all 1 could be everybody at the wedding, right? With all of you as my witness, that makes sense, right? All 2, everyone at the wedding and the deceased, most significantly Phil's father and Chrissy's brother. Okay, that's a different reader or different listener. They have more knowledge than just the default all 1. Or all 3, everyone at the ceremony and the deceased, my dad and Chrissy's brother and God. All right, well, that's a different listener, reader. And then all 4, everyone at the ceremony, the deceased, and God, and the divine spirit and nature. Now, who in the world would come with all 4? Okay, really, who's part of all of these And who would ultimately get that all four is a complete understanding of the different alls. Well, what are the pre-reading expectations? What was the reading experience? You need to list these. What did you focus on while you were listening to the ceremony? What are the possible available interpretations? We did that, all 1 through all 4. And what are the consequences of the interpretation? What I mean by that is which one most resonates, has the most positive effect upon the reader. And there'll be different reasons for why a certain interpretation resonates with the reader and certain interpretations do not. Okay? Would an ideal reader of my wedding have access to all 4 interpretations of all and be able to assess the value of the differing interpretations and favor one based upon the one that has the most favorable consequences? Yes, I would make the argument, right? That I was hoping, but fully realizing that there'd be many different interpretations out there, that they would arrive at all 4, but I realized that they did not all arrive at all 4, and let's look at it, okay? So the photographer doesn't know me at all, has been hired to take some pictures, arrives at all 1. Why? Everybody at the wedding, with all as my witness, everybody at the wedding. That's all she has. She doesn't know my dad, she doesn't know Chrissy's brother, she doesn't know if I'm religious, she certainly doesn't know that I believe there's a divine spirit in nature. Okay? Well, friends, right? They're just, not the best friend, not, the one that's closest to you, but people that have come to the wedding and they're listening to the ceremony, and they arrive at all 2, which is everyone at the wedding and the deceased, my father and Chrissy's brother. They would know that I meant all, and on their minds would be their 2 important people who weren't here. Okay? So they arrive at all 2, and they stop. They wouldn't get beyond that, right? Because they didn't have access to it. Their default context, their pre-reading expectation wouldn't let them get beyond it. And the reading experience didn't allow them to get beyond it. So that's all they get. And all 3, my mother, right? She is on her mind, no question about it, is that this is a religious ceremony, even though what didn't happen at a church. She would certainly have her husband on her mind and her desire to be there, and then everybody at the ceremony would be easily arrived at. Okay? Well, my best man gets to everybody at the ceremony, my father and Chrissy's brother, God, and the divine spirit in nature, knowing that I simultaneously believe in sort of transcendental belief that there's divine spirit in the natural world, particularly wild places. I have strong faith in God, and it's clearly my father and Chrissy's brother being on his mind, and then everyone at the ceremony. So look, how did he get there? He got there because of his pre-reading expectations. The reading experience got him there, right? As there are mentions of my father and Chrissy's brother at the ceremony. His available interpretations and the one that most resonated with him. Okay? The one that most resonated with my mom stopped her at God. With my friends, stopped them with the deceased. With the photographer, stopped her with just the people at the ceremony. And Reader Response Critic would say they're all legitimate. They're all valid ways of interpreting, and they're determined by these 4 stages. So what I'd like for you to do is to have at it on a poem of your choice. And below this video there should be a poem that you could choose from to apply these 4 steps. What are your pre-reading expectations of that poem? What happened to you during the reading experience? List a few available interpretations, then choose the one that has the greatest resonance, the greatest positive consequence on your psychological needs, on your desires, your wish fulfillments, and that is the one that, according to Reader Response Critic, is the most valuable interpretation.